So in this presentation we're going to build up our knowledge and extend what we looked at. And in the first unit, we're going to look at public key, private key and key exchange. We won't be seeing the complete story yet because we need to actually look at digital certificates and hash functions and so on, but at least give us a basic understanding of what really public key and private key are, how they're used, and how we can use key exchange to be able to create keys and then allow Bob and Alice to be able to have the same shared key. So we'll be looking a bit at private key, especially around some of the methods, AES, to fish and so on. We'll be looking at how we can analyse block or stream ciphers, and then the different methods that we actually use for our cryptography, such as the alternate codebook. And then we'll look at a key area of salting to make sure that the cipher we create actually changes each time that we actually encrypt or create the cipher text. Then we'll look at public key, especially around RSA. We might have time to look at LGAML too, an elliptic curve, and we'll definitely look at the important area of key exchange, especially with Diffie-Hellman. Okay, so there we are, and as we'll find, we'll come back on to John Napier later because he's very important in terms of discovering logarithms, which are used fairly extensively in the work that we're going to look at. So what we have is Bob and we have Alice, and it's our duty to be able to keep things secret, so privacy, and we'll see we typically use private key for that. We need to make sure that Bob is able to identify himself to Alice, and Alice does the same thing the other way. So as we'll see, we use private key, public key often for that, and then we need to make sure that the messages are actually sent correctly and haven't been modified or changed. So for that we use public and private key together to create the integrity. In the next unit we'll be looking more at Trent and how we set up digital certificates and so on. Okay, so here's what we ended up with in the previous unit. We use a standard encryption algorithm that everybody knows about. It's well published. Even Eve knows all about it and how to use it. And what we must do is to be able to use a key, a special key that only Bob and Alice actually know, and it becomes too difficult for Eve to be able to try all the possible keys to be able to find the one that actually works correctly. If we have a certain key space with a certain number of keys, then the average that we'll take is about half the key space to be able to, on average, find the right key that's involved. So we'll be looking at that in more detail in a future unit. But for just now, we assumed that the more keys that we have, the more secure the message actually becomes. So here's what we have. We have a symmetric encryption. That's where we have one key. So it's a bit like having a key for a front door, and you might share the keys with all the people that you trust, and everybody has the same key. So the key we use to encrypt or lock is the same key as the one that decrypts or unlocks. And we see RC2, RC4, DES, 3DES, AES, and so on. And then public key encryption involves two keys, asymmetric encryption, where one key encrypts and the other key decrypts. We can use them either way, it doesn't really matter, but one is applied and then the other one, and it does the reverse and gets the data back. RSA, DSA, and so on, LGAML, are all public key methods. And then in the next unit we'll be looking at our hash functions, our one-way function, where we go from our data into a one-way function which can't really be reversed mathematically to produce our fingerprint. And we'll see MD5 and SHA-1 are typical one-way hashes. Okay, so obviously the more bits that we use in terms of our keys, the more keys there are and the more secure it is. As we'll find out, we're up to about here in terms of secret symmetric key encryption. 72 bits is the state of the art. It's taken over a year for even very large computers to crack 72 bits. Anything under that is probably easily crackable. Certainly 56 was passed quite a while ago, 64-bit too, and we're kind of up here in terms of our private key. In terms of public key, we're up now about 2048 bits are often used in terms of creating our keys. Okay, so this just gives us a basic roadmap really of what really happens in many systems. The real workhorse for the secure channel that we use is around secret key or private key, and that's typically DES, 3DES or AES. That's really the workhorse that's keeping everything secret. We create a session key typically, and the session key is negotiated through Diffie-Hellman method. That's for key exchange. And then actually public key is used to prove the identity of each of the entities. So we'll actually see that too. So a typical size of key there, 2040 bits for RSA, 160 bits for L-gamma. One basic way to classify our encryption algorithms is whether they use block encryption or stream encryption. So in terms of these, block encryption is the most popular and it's probably the most robust. With this we take our plaintext or the data that we're going to encrypt, and we package it up into 128 bits or 256 bits at a time, and then these go into our message blocks. A key is then applied into the Cipher algorithm and produces a cipher block. Then what happens is that each of these gets added on, and then we end up with a whole big chunk of cipher text. Okay, so in this way, the more data that we have going in, the longer the cipher block will be. So you can actually tell how much data has been encrypted purely by the size of the cipher block. If it doesn't quite fit into the 128 bits, then we have some padding at the end of just rubbish data that's really just ignored on the other side. The other method that we have, and it's used in RC4, used to be used in WEP and was a complete disaster, is to use a cipher stream. In this case, RC2 uses what's called an infinite key. So it takes a secret key, such as a password, adds on an initial seed, normally called an initialization vector, to really start it off at a certain point, and then that then creates an infinitely long key. The key itself is then exclusive OR with each bit that comes along. So a 1 and a 0 gives us a 1, and then a 1 and a 1 gives us a 0, and so on. Okay, so it's very simple. All that really needs to happen, a simple exclusive OR gate. We don't need any complicated hardware, and even the infinite pseudo infinite key generation is quite a simple process for us. So this was used when hardware was fairly limited. And here we see it here. Netscape were the first to produce the SSL or integrate SSL into the browsers, and we can actually see that they're actually using RC4 here, 128-bit, and here's RC4 here. The IV vector goes in, initialization vector and the key, and then there's our stream, and then we just exclusive OR that with the data stream to give us our output. On the other side, we just need to know what the initialization vector is and the key, and we'll produce the same infinite key, and all we have to do is exclusive OR it back, and that's it. So it's fairly simple. So now let's look at the first main method, and that's the private key. So private key is really the workhorse of the industry, and it's highly optimized, it's fast, it's efficient, and is really used in many occasions to do the streaming and the storing of our Cipher data. And so here are some of the main methods that we have. DES was one of the first ones that was actually used in commercial environment, used a lot in the finance industry, used 64 bits, but only 56 bits were actually usable as a key. So it's probably now extremely easy to crack the 56-bit one now. So to overcome that and to keep compatibility, they created 3DES, which has 3 main stages to it, and has 3 keys for each of the stages, but we normally use the same key for the first and the last stage. So our equivalent key is really just the 2 times the 56, which is 112 bits there. It's equivalent key size. So it's well above the 72 bits area that could be crackable. So basically what we do is we put it through an encryption process with key 1, a decryption process with key 2, and an encryption process with key 3, and then we get our output. So it's obviously going to be much slower than many of the other algorithms, which will do just one round basically, but it keeps compatibility with existing systems. Bruce Nair produced Twofish, and that's a popular encryption algorithm. We also have Blowfish over here, used quite a lot in many systems. And RC2 is Ron Rivest Cipher. RC is Rivest Cipher, and it can take various different sizes of keys for that. 40 bits is obviously fairly weak, and along with that we get Skipjack and Camellia, RC4, Affine, and so on. But the one that's most highly recommended was created by these 2 chaps here. And that is Rendal, or AES, and this one uses 128, 192, 256-bit keys, and was selected by NIST in 2001 after quite a lengthy process of evaluation. So you should find that when you look at the main site, if you go to encryption, then we have all the major encryption algorithms there. If you just scroll down from there they all are. You can have a look at any one that you want. So there's Blowfish, and you can put in your text and your key, and it should generate that. We often use a standard vector to test it. Fred and Bert should give that in base 64. So there's the hex, and then we decrypt it back just to make sure. So if you're ever unsure about what they should give you for the text and for the key, then you can just go onto the site and have a look. Okay, but AES is the one that's really the most robust just now, and it's used fairly extensively in industry. Anything 128 bits and above is highly secure. 256 bits is rock solid security. Okay, so there's some of the ones: 3DES, RC2, and Rendal. As part of the tutorial, we'll actually be looking at some of these methods, and we'll see how they actually implement. So the problem that we have is really how we can get a key from Bob to Alice. So when we look at our key exchange, we'll see how actually that is done in real life. Another problem that we have really, if we just take our text and convert it to ciphertext, then if the algorithm isn't sort of produces the same ciphertext each time, then Eve can actually just play back the ciphertext to Alice. She maybe doesn't know what's in it, but Eve can generally just play that back again and again, and can even copy and paste messages together and put them together in ciphertext that make actual sense. So what we do is we add salt to the encryption algorithm to make sure that every single time that we encrypt, the same message will get a different cipher block, so it makes it more difficult for it to be interpreted or used again. Okay, so our basic method is what's called the electronic codebook method, which is weak. It basically takes each block at a time, and then we'll encrypt each block with the keys, which means that for the same data we'll get the same output. With salt, what we have is an initialization vector, and our key is only used for the first round of the encrypted blocks. And then, as we'll see, there is a chaining effect that goes on to the other one, and so this thing here really provides that salt that will actually change our data. So this shows an example of CBC, which is cipher block chaining. We use our key for the first block, and then initialization vector, we exclusive OR the block with initialization vector and encrypt it, and then we take the output from the first block and then feed it into the second one, exclusive OR that, so it will generally scramble the output. We can actually see it if we use electronic codebook here. Then we can see that areas of the same data, so if we look at our penguin, and you actually find that when the data is broken up, it's broken up into pixel blocks. So this one here is actually really the same data as we have over here. So this is what really happens, is that area comes out the same as that one because there's no salt involved, and then similar areas will actually come out the same, so you can actually start to see the picture. So even though we're using the high grade AES, you can see that without salt our data becomes noticeable, and we can see patterns. If we use the cipher block chaining, we can see that it produces what's really called noise. We detect encryption because the bits within properly encrypted content just looks like complete noise, ones and zeros, and we can't make any sense of it. If you're interested, this is what DES uses. It has a number of iterations that goes through, 16 different iterations it goes. There's an initial permutation of the bits to scramble them up, and there's a final permutation of the bits again to scramble up these 64 bits that are coming in. So all the bits come in here, they get moved about with that, and then at the end they get moved about, so bit position 1 becomes bit position 58 and so on. Then they go through a basic iteration, the key is then scrambled, the iteration does something in there, then it goes on to the next stage, the key is then scrambled again, and then they go through there. So that's what our general sort of flow that we get for our encryption process. It looks a bit like this, where there's a number of stages, number of iterations and scrambling, and what's hoped is that there isn't a weakness that allows somebody to find a way around the algorithm. Okay, if you're interested, this is the basic process that happens in each of the stages that we get. There's various tables that are lookup tables, and there's some exclusive ORs goes on, and a substitution box that will substitute one bit values into another, and so on. So that's what it generally looks like. Okay, and that's the example of the substitution box that it goes through as part of each of these stages. Okay, there's our data going into the stage, goes through, does the substitution, and then this is what it is coming out of it. Okay, and then for the decryption we have the opposite process that actually happens. The substitution is then reversed. Okay, so the problem that we have now is that how does Bob get his key that he's just created to Alice without Eve actually listening and finding out the key. Eve could have stolen the key in some way, so we need to make sure that Bob and Alice can generate the key. Could be a session key where every single time they connect then we'll get a new key, or it could be a long-term key that they actually use, but we just need some way that they can actually talk to each other and they agree a key. One way is to create an out-of-band communication, such as through the postal service or telephone and so on. But again, there's no guarantee that Eve isn't listening to all the communications and can actually find out the key. Okay, so we use a key exchange method to be able to get the key from one side to the next. Increasingly, what we're doing is using session keys, so that every single connection that we're making is a new key. So even if Eve gets that key, then the next session that's created, she won't be able to read the communications. And it's really solved by Whitfield Diffie, who came up with the Diffie-Hellman method, amazing little method that allows Bob and Alice to communicate quite openly and then to come up with the same end value that they can use. And it's really based on logarithms and indices. And here's the basic proof behind the use of indices. So if we take a value, if you remember from school, a to the power of x, so let's say that's 2 to the power of 3, multiplied by a to the power of y, say that's 2 to the power of 4. Then when we multiply them together, that is the same as 2 to the power of 3 plus 4, or 7. 2 to the power of 7. So we'll just check that becomes 8, and that becomes, sorry, that's 2, 4, 8, and that becomes 16. And when we multiply together, we get 128, which is the same as 2 to 7, which is 128. So that's fine. The other property that we have is that a to the power of x to the power of y becomes a to the power of xy. So again, if we did this one, 2 to the power of 3 raised to the power of 4 gives us 2 to the power of 12. Okay, so you can calculate that if you want, but it does actually work. Okay, so when we raise to the power of, then we multiply the indices. When we just multiply with the same base, then we add them together. Okay, so if you just remember that. So here's how Diffie-Hellman actually works, and it's quite a genius method. So Bob comes up with a random value x, and Alice with a random value of y. And both of them agree, and even Eve knows about the value of a. So everybody knows about it, and it's actually agreed. So what happens is that Bob takes a and gets the value a to the power of x, and Alice does the same thing, a to the power of y, and then they send over to each other their values. Okay, so Bob receives this one back, and Alice receives this one. What happens next is that Bob then takes his value of x and raises it to a to the y to the power of x, and then Alice does a to the x to the power of y, and as we've seen from a few slides back, that becomes a to the power of xy, and this one becomes a to the power of xy. So both values actually agree in the end, and we end up with the same values on either side. Okay, obviously Eve could actually find out the value of x because she knows y, so we actually introduce the concept of mod, and we have a mod n, and the security of it is that it's actually very difficult to find the actual value of x when we bring in this modulus value. Okay, so here's how it works. It's the same as what we've seen. There's g and n, which are, so n is going to be our thing that we use for the mod, so prime number, and then we do a does g to the power of x mod n, and Alice calculates g to the power of y mod n. They exchange their values, and then Bob raises it. He gets up to his x value, and then that is y, and they should end up with the exact same value. So it all just works out perfectly. So we can have a look at an example. So we should have our little Diffie-Hellman. Diffie-Hellman 1 here. It's a little Diffie-Hellman calculator. Okay, so there's a value, there's some values, there's x value, y value, so that's g to the power g to the power of x. So I just bring up the calculator just to check that. So it's 277 to the power of 13, and then we're going to do mod 1 2 5 9 907. Perfect. Okay, this does the same thing with our random number. So let's take let's take Bob's value, send it over to Alice, and let's see what we think the agreed key will be. So we'll take 907 and then we'll raise it to the power of 20, which is Alice's value, and then we'll take the mod of 1 2 5 9. Okay, 982. There we go. Perfect. Works perfectly. So you should find when you do your little calculations, then everything should work out fine. We've got a few little examples here that you can actually try out, but it can all be done on a calculator quite easily, and to prove that it actually works. So you should be able to do the same. You take this value, raise it to the power of 13, and then take the mod of that, and everything will work perfectly. Okay, so that's the magic of the Diffie-Hellman method. Alice can listen to these values, Eve can listen to these values, and she won't be able to determine what the end shared key actually is. Okay, so there's an example there, but we can see that we've just looked at one. The problem with Diffie-Hellman is that Eve can get actually in the middle and actually can negotiate two keys which are used. One is used to encrypt between Bob and Alice. She then decrypts and then re-encrypts with another key. As far as Bob and Alice is concerned, they're communicating quite happily with each other and they've negotiated a key, but actually Eve is in between. So we've looked at private key, we've looked at key exchange. Now what we'll do is we'll look at public key and see how public key is actually used. But in the next presentation we'll actually see in more detail really where it's used. So up to now that we can see that we can allow Bob and Alice to be able to communicate securely. We can pass a key between them so that Eve can't actually tell what the key is. But up to now we've not been able to really prove that Bob is Bob and Alice is Alice. So we'll see how public key really helps with that, especially in proving identity. So one of the most popular methods that we can get a public key encryption is based on the difficulty of factorizing a large number. So computers have real difficulty in determining the original sources of a multiplication. In this case we have P and Q, which are two large numbers, prime numbers, and then we multiply them together and then we get a result, and it's quite difficult for a computer to be able to reverse that back again. And it was really solved by these three guys here, Ron Rivest, Aldi Shamir and Len Aldiman, who came up with the public key encryption method in 1977. And it was really based on some of the concepts behind the Diffie-Hellman method. Okay, so we won't go into any great detail into public key, but basically we start with two prime numbers and then we calculate a value of n by multiplying the two primes together. In this case 3 and 11 to give us 33. We calculate phi, which is this p minus 1 and q minus 1, 20. And then what we do is that we take the greatest common denominator between a value that we're going to pick, e, and phi, so that there isn't any common factors between them apart from 1. Okay, So we select that value, and that value becomes our public key that we have. So if you want, you can have a look at practical RSA calculation, and it goes through the complete process of it. And so you should find that is on the website here. There's a simple calculation there. Okay, so there's P and Q. Generate another one which is different. Okay, 2931. So we calculate n by the multiplication of the two together. Okay, in this case it's 899. We calculate phi, which is 30 times 28, which gives us that. And then we're going to pick E, so that the greatest common denominator between our value of phi and E, the value that we pick, is going to be 1. Okay, so there's no factors in between. We can then go on, and that becomes our encryption key, which is E and N. Then from there we can calculate our decryption key. Used this formula here, and that becomes our public key and our private key. And then we can use that to be able to generate, to encode, and then encrypt, and then decrypt. Okay, so you can have a look at the basic mathematics behind it if you have time. Okay, so we end up with this E, N, our public key, and then D and N for our private key. And it's quite difficult for an intruder to be able to find out the original factors which made those values. Okay, so here we are. There's our public key and private key. So what we want to do is to make sure that the messages that Alice receives are secure. So when Bob is sending to Alice, Alice will send in some way. We'll come into that in more detail. Our public key. Bob will encrypt with the public key, and then the only key that can actually decrypt is going to be the private key here. Okay, so in this case Bob isn't using any of his keys just now, but we'll see how that's used a little bit later. Okay, so here's the example that we can have. So there we go. We use the public key there, and then we use the private key to be able to decrypt. Okay, so there's the process. Get Alice's public key, encrypt, send it over, and then use the public key to encrypt, and then the private key to decrypt. Alice should never give away this key, because that's her unique key, and the same on this side. Bob should never publish his private key. Okay, only his public key. Okay, so we'll go into more detail about how that happens, and especially how we use this magical little private key later on. Okay, so the way that, as we'll see in the next presentation, the way that we distribute the keys, in this case this is Bob's certificate, and Bob's certificate will hold Bob's public key on it, and can actually send that through to Alice. Alice will have the same, and that's an easy way for us to contain our keys. So let's go through an example, and again we'll go into more detail about this in the next unit. But we take a message, and we take a fingerprint of it, MD5 hash of it, and then Bob encrypts with his private key, and then he encrypts that little MD5 and then adds it to the message. So now which key will he use to be able to send the secure message to Alice? Well, it'll be Alice's public key. So Bob then takes her public key, then takes that whole message and encrypted, and then we'll encrypt the whole thing into them. After that, he sends it over. So what key will be used to open up the encrypted content? Well, of course, it's Alice's private key. She then opens it up, reads the message. Everything's fine, it's been kept secure, and no one could have read the message along the way. But how does she know that it was really Bob that actually sent the message? Well, what she'll do is that the only key that will unlock this little encrypted content, can you think which one? Actually, we encrypted it with his private key, so it's Bob's public key. So then Alice does a quick check on the message to make sure that she finds out the fingerprint on it. She then decrypts the encrypted content with Bob's public key. So the only key that could have encrypted that was his private key. So then she then unencrypts to find the MD5. She then compares, and the comparison will prove not only the message is correct as it was sent, but also that it was Bob that sent the email. Okay, so that's how all works to keep secure and to prove identity, and also to prove the integrity of the messages. Magic. Okay, so that's been really a quick run through public key, private key, and key exchange. I do have a couple of other little related subjects. This is one method here. So with normal encryption, when we apply the encryption, we've got to take the encryption off in the right sequence. So if we apply the blue key, then the red key must decrypt, and then the blue key must decrypt. With cumulative encryption, we can actually create certain keys that allow us to take the encryption off in any order. So in this case, we've applied the blue key and then the red key. Then we can decrypt with the blue key, and then decrypt with the red key, and everything works. So that's cumulative encryption. Another method that's quite popular just now is what's called LGAML, which uses the difficulty of factorizing discrete logarithms. So here's some basic facts about logarithms. So the great thing about logarithms is when we multiply two numbers together, if we take the log, then we can just add them together, and then we can take the inverse log. When we divide, then we can take the logs away from each other. This is our other principles that we have in here. Okay, so this is similar to what we had before. There's the a to the x mod p, and so on, and there's an example that we can actually use. And really, we're using the same principle as we saw before. A to the power of y with x actually becomes a to the power of xy, and it all works out, so they all work out with the same value. And really, the difficulty that we see, or the intruder sees, is that we bring in this mod p. The mod is a prime number here, and what happens is that there are many values that can be created, which if Eve knows about p and y and g, then there are so many values that are possible to actually create the same resulting three values that it's almost impossible for Eve to actually factorize and find out what the original value of x was that Bob selected as his random. So that's how the whole thing really works. So in this case, 3 to the power 4 mod 17 gives us 13. So Eve could see these values, and even though these three, Eve will struggle to actually find out a valid value, or the value that's been used for y to make the whole thing work. And that's really how LGAML actually works. We have a value x, which is random. We have a g value that we select, and then we have a p value, which is our prime number. Okay, remember that's got to be a prime number to make the whole thing work. And then we can have our g value here. So really, we select these ones, and then what we do is that we have the random one. We send this p value, the g value, and the y value to Alice. Alice uses her value, her y value, to do the same, sends that across, and they should end up with the same resulting value. Okay, so that's really how the whole thing actually works. As a last thing, let's look at a pretty pretty unique way of actually encrypting email, and we'll see it uses public key encryption. And it was invented by, or it was created by Phil Zinnerman, who wanted to create secure email. So the magic of it happens is that we create a unique session key for every single email that we create, and so PGP uses the IDEA encryption method. It's a secret key method. So we create a new key. So what happens is that we take the data, and then what we do is that Bob does his normal signing thing with his private key and so on to prove his identity, and then we use this session key to be able to encrypt the data and this identity checking. And then what we do is we take the session key and we encrypt with Alice's public key. Okay, so if you think about it, that's like putting the key that you've used into a box with Alice's padlock and then locking the box, so that when it goes over the side, she will open up the box, take out the session key, then unencrypt the data and the identity, and just as we did before. So the magic of this is that it's only using public key for the small little bit of the process, and really it's normal private key that's actually used to be able to do the core decryption there. Okay, so that's how PGP actually works. In the next lecture we'll look in more detail at hash functions and digital certificates and so on. Okay, thank you.